We have now launched the online Shockwave course. When I set the company up, which is over 12 years ago now, which is hard to believe, I was always about educating the clinicians as well, not just in terms of the technology. So when Dom Smith came to me with this idea of doing the Shockwave course, I was all for it. And Dom and Katie have done a fantastic job of putting it together. It's really impressive, really comprehensive. It is technology agnostic, so whatever system you're using will be able to help you with this. So it's a brilliant piece of work. The guys have done really well. So check it out and go to the link below and let us know what you think.
Hello, welcome. Today I am joined by Dr. Craig Ranson, who is Director of Athlete Health and Performance Data at the UK Sports Institute. Craig, how are you doing?
Very well, thanks, Andy. Thanks very much for having me on.
It's a pleasure. And like since the last time I saw you, which is probably getting on for probably almost 2 months ago now, time just flies, doesn't it?
It does, yes. We're already into February of this year, so yeah, January has certainly flown by. Plenty on.
So when we met for breakfast in Manchester that couple of months ago, you were going off to do a something with Manchester Metropolitan University.
Yep.
How was that event?
Yeah, it was terrific actually. So yeah, one of my roles within the athlete health team at the UK Sports Institute is to oversee female athlete health and performance workstream. And we've recently signed a memorandum of understanding and a collaboration with Manchester Met for a Women in Sports Centre of Excellence, and so that was kicking that off that afternoon. And it was fantastic to have so many stakeholders from sport and from academia and from institutes who were keen to be involved in that. So whilst it's with Manchester Met, it's very much looking at, can we get a national and international collaboration around enhancing female athlete health and performance through the Centre of Excellence.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So how does something like that happen? Because you hear of these things happening. There's
Yes.
there's various things going on in different parts of the world. But how does something like that tangible happen?
Yeah, I guess what's one of the strengths of an institute type setup, which most countries in Olympic and Paralympic sport have some form of institute, or the leading countries do. There's probably 15, 20 around the world who are at the heart of their performance systems. And I guess it's sort of the part of the remit of institutes is to bring together collaborations where they can contribute to enhancing health and performance. And this is one of those. We have a lot of our practitioners, so we have 300 science and medicine practitioners who work for the Institute. They often have affiliations with other organisations, and so we try and leverage them. So, for example, our lead for health and performance is Richard Burden, who he works across academia and for the Institute. He has colleagues working at Manchester Met and does the work there himself. And again, that partnership can then bloom from there. So I think it's having that network of people that you can lean on, but also having a mechanism for doing it, which is what the Institute allows us to drive.
When you're setting up something like that, do you have specific tangible outcomes that you're looking to achieve by a specific time frame?
Not directly in terms of really specific objectives. However, within this is something, it's a way that I really like to work. And again, the Institute and the UK high performance system in general is known for it, is having a really good strategic approach. So having a vision, I think the most important thing is having a vision of where you want to go and what things might look like in whether it's a 5-year or a 10-year horizon. What might good really look like? And then where are you now? And then where are the gaps in between that you need to bridge to get to that vision? And that's what drives the specificity of your strategy. So, ensuring that there are high performance opportunities for female athletes where there is, equity in those opportunities, but also equity of care, equity of performance support, equity of opportunity is probably where the vision is. Then if for 5-10 years time, then okay, what needs to happen in order to enable that? And they're the specific projects that'll go on within that.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's really good. And it's to see women's sport. It's really got so much emphasis, certainly on the football side of things.
Yeah.
That's becoming such a bigger thing, and the emphasis on the sports medicine side. So, yeah, good. We look forward to see how that project. It's only down the road from us as well, so it's quite handy to see
Yes,
how that all develops.
Fantastic facility too, and great people at Manchester Met to collaborate with.
Absolutely. Well, it's my old college as well, so it's
Oh,
even more so on
there
that
you go.
side.
Produces good people as well.
Oh, stop it! Thank you. So yeah, so for you then, so where are you from originally?
Yeah, so I grew up in outback Western Australia. My father was a school principal, so I was working out the other day. Actually, I went to 8 different schools. If you work for the government there, you get shifted around every 1, 2, 3 years. So we lived all over the state, all over Australia growing up, which was great. And then went to university in Perth, was a physiotherapist by trade. That was my training. And then spent 25 years working in mostly in sport all over the world as a physiotherapist.
So when you say outback, what constitutes the outback? Well, I'm familiar with the phrase and I've driven through it.
Yeah, well, I mean, Western Australia is a huge state. It's sort of the size of Western Europe, and there's only 2 million people who live in that area, and 1.5 million of those live in the capital city. So you've got 500,000 people in a massive surface area. And we were in places as far as Broome in the north, which is 3,000 kilometres north of Perth. I was at boarding school at the time in year 11 and 12, and to get home for a boarding weekend, it was a 4-hour flight on a 747. So it's a long way. We lived in places like Kalgoorlie, which is a mining town, which is 600 kilometres inland from Perth, where there's no water supply, so the water has to be piped from Perth to Kalgoorlie. And some wheat belt farming towns as well, where the farms are 50,000 acres, 100,000 acres. So proper bush, as we call it.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing country. Like you say, the geography of it is hard to comprehend until
Yes.
you've been there and experienced it
Yeah.
and driven round it, which I've done. But it's an amazing place. And Perth's an amazing city, isn't it? It's constantly voted one of the top cities as a place to live.
Yeah, I mean, it is a lovely place to live. I mean, I think West Australia has probably shaped a lot of my values and my interests. Is every country town we lived in centres around sport. The sports centre, which has the football field, the tennis courts, the netball field, the hockey club, the bowling club, are all generally in one spot, and they're the hubs of towns. And every weekend you pack up and you move to the neighbouring town to play your fixtures, and the whole town moves around. These 5 or 6 towns are in your region, which might cover a 300 square kilometre region. And it's really that's the focus of the lifestyle, apart from whatever it's mining or agriculture. But that really shapes places, and they revolve around the sport and the sports clubs.
But why do you think it is so sport heavy? Because it is associated with sport, Australia.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just something about sport that brings people together, and everyone can do, whether it's lawn bowls and golf or Australian rules football, and everyone can get involved in, and needs everyone to get involved with. You need goal umpires, and you need referees, and you need managers of teams, so the whole community gets involved, even if you're not playing the sport. And it becomes a real sense of pride. I mean, lots of other cultural aspects as well. The Indigenous cultures is thriving now, or beginning to get much more emphasis in country towns, and the arts as well is starting to grow. But still, sport tends to dominate life in country Western Australia and country Australia in general.
And so why physio?
Yeah, why physio? I mean, I guess like many physios, people who wanted to be involved in sport, maybe not quite good enough, or never had the opportunity to be a top level professional full-time sportsman. Spending a fair bit of time at the physio myself as a kid, and that's how I got interested in taking it on. So you start very young in Australia. I mean, I was 17 when I first started in the first year of a degree. And so it's very young for deciding, what you're going to be for the rest of your life. And I think it was a good decision for me. I really enjoyed my physiotherapy career. But it's probably something I would advise people a bit against now is going straight into a vocational course. Take a bit of time to find out what you want to do with your life and explore things a bit more before you take on a vocational course as a 17, 18-year-old. No regrets for me.
I agree and understand that. We've got a student placement person who's with us now on marketing, and she's been brilliant. So we've had her for this year.
Yeah.
And I think she says she's learned so much from being in a workplace.
Yes.
And I reflect on me going to Manchester Metropolitan like at 18. I did not have a clue. You're on a conveyor belt I need to go to university.
Yep.
Whereas I definitely didn't make the most of it. However, you just mature at different times. And I think a
Yep.
lot of people I've chatted to on here that they've been mature students and they've taken it a lot more
Yeah.
seriously, I think.
Yeah. And that's exactly what my experience as well. I mean, I've worked as in universities at teaching and researching for 20 odd years as well. And certainly something that I've noticed, and even in my own undergraduate studies, as a 17, 18-year-old, you don't take it as seriously. But those students who did physiotherapy as mature students, they knew what they wanted to do. And they didn't have time to mess around, and they studied hard, and they made sure that they could have been earning money. So they made sure that they got good grades and got their degrees. And again, you see it with all the courses that I've taught, those people who were average students at high school, possibly a little bit better as an undergrad, but really shone as postgrads because they knew what they want to do, and they really got stuck into it. So I always encourage people to say, well, what should I do? My child's interested in this or this. Say, well, take your time, go and as you say, get some work experience, see the real world, do a general degree, find out what you're interested in, and then there's just so many good vocational courses that you can do, transfer into, or do as a postgrad nowadays, and recommend that if you can have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right, and just any sort of exposure to dealing with people working, working in the service industry, anything is great skills, isn't it? Really, like just working in a shop, working, any sort of interaction, I think is just really valuable. Of being able to speak to people, listen to people, all of those things.
Yeah, and also to fend for yourself. I mean, to go off and do a gap year and travel and have to organise yourself and do all your own planning and manage your own money, all of those things are invaluable life skills as well. So yes, you get some of that at university, but if you have to hold down a job or manage a year of travelling, you learn. That's the adult model of learning, is learning by doing. People as adults learn much better by doing stuff, and so get as much experience as you can. No such thing as bad experience is a good term that I once heard.
Yeah.
And also don't be afraid to change. You might have trained as something that you're not quite sure of. You're not, you certainly had experience of this. I've had as well. It's not one career for life, especially nowadays. There's so much opportunity. So taking a risk and making a change is something that I always encourage people to do as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then, like, for you then, so did you at 17, did you have a pathway or plan or goal, vision as what you wanted to be?
No, I don't think I had one at 50. And I've never been one of those people that think, okay, I've got to do this job or get this experience in order to do the next thing. My philosophy has always been do the best at the thing that you're doing at the moment, and opportunities will come. I probably, if I'm looking back, I probably would be a little bit more strategic and sort of think, okay, where would I like to be? And again, using that performance planning model that we talked about, what's the vision for 5 years? Where do you want to be? And then what might you need to do to get there? But I've never overly engineered that. I say, just do the best you can in the role that you're doing at the moment, and people recognise that. You'll develop good relationships, and opportunities will come.
Yeah, you've obviously gone on to get some great positions as well, though. So maybe sometimes having that structure would have limited you, or may have set you back. So you never know, do you, with having a plan for things?
No, and there's never a good time for a role to come up. So a lot of people often say, oh, it was a great job and a great opportunity, but it wasn't the right time. There's never a right time. So sometimes you sort of think, actually, that looks a fantastic opportunity. Am I really going to have a crack at it and go for it? Because it might not come around again. And it very, very rarely do they come at the right time for people.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. It is a good point. So as part of your undergrad that you were doing then, so how long is that then if you're starting at 17?
Yeah, Australia, most vocational undergrad degrees are 4 years. So physiotherapy in this country, typically undergrad degree is 3 years. In Australia, it's a 4-year degree. And then usually you go and work in a hospital, which I did for a couple of years in a big teaching hospital, do your rotations, working through the different areas. And then, as I did, a lot of people in those days in the 90s would go and work overseas, whether that was in the UK or at the time, there was a big shortage of physiotherapists in the US. So I went to the US for 3 years and so did about half my class, and the half of my class, the class above and below. So we were all in the States. There was, you know, hundreds of us at the time. So there was a real and hundreds of people from South Africa, from the UK, from New Zealand, who all could get these H-1B visas to work in the States as physiotherapists. So there was a whole industry of contracting companies who would bring people in to be physiotherapists and occupational therapists working in the States. So it was a really unique setup and a fantastic way to travel around the US, working 3 to 6 months in each place and experiencing life there, but also having a community of people to lean on as well.
Where did you go to in the US?
So I had first year was mostly in Louisiana, so New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and then went up to New England. So I was in Maine and New Hampshire for another year or two, which was terrific. So real contrast between the South and the North of the US, very different cultures, very different climates, but both great fun.
Yeah, I bet they were great. Bourbon Street, I guess you spent a fair bit of time on there.
We had a few Mardi Gras there, definitely, and there seemed to be a party on every night in New Orleans. Scary place to live, don't get me wrong, but fantastic culture, and I still love the food and the music.
Yeah, no, I love going to the US. It's like my realization of this is I always thought the UK and the US very similar, probably language and so on. But the more I deal with them, which is it's like I feel like it's so different to the UK.
Yes.
How did you find it going from Australia?
Yeah, I mean, in those days, I mean, there was running jokes about, I mean, and it's a stereotype, but it sometimes holds true with people, and the naivety that sometimes they have, especially about Australia. You know, they're thinking there's kangaroos running down every street. There certainly are running down some streets, but you know, people would ask how long it would take me to drive from Australia to get to the US, because when you see a map of the US, you see, you know, you just see a map of the US, so people think that it's that all the borders are connected, and you know, there is and very distinct cultures from state to state as well. As I say, you know, Louisiana has a very distinct culture to Texas, which is its neighbor, to Georgia, which is on the other side, and let alone from north to south. So it's a lot of like 50 mini countries within one. And the landscapes and the beaches and the mountains, you know, it's one of those places that's got every type of landscape known to man as well. So yeah, terrific place to visit. Don't think I'd want to live there for my whole life, but certainly everyone should aspire to live there for some of their life, I reckon.
Yeah. It is. I'm the same mind. I think it's quite a harsh place. It's got some brilliant bits, and I was listening to something where it was saying if you've got money, there's no better place to be than the US.
Yeah.
If you haven't got money, then it's maybe a slightly different proposition.
Yeah.
So for you then, so going over there for 3 years, bearing in mind you'd had that upbringing where you had moved around a lot, how helpful was that you'd had that experience to go into the US?
Yeah, and I think that's where, again, growing up, moving around a lot, growing up around sport, it sort of shaped my whole life, because I tended to move around and not being worried about being in another country or even within a country. I think we've moved 4 or 5 times within the UK over the last 20 years. So certainly it seems to be in the UK, and again, a stereotype, but people tend to stay where they are. A little more if the kids are in school, we can't move the kids in school. I mean, I went to 8 different schools, not to say it did do any harm, but you know, I think there's a lot to be learned by travel and by experiencing different cultures. You know, I had 7 years in Wales, which was absolutely fantastic, and learning from the culture there. And I think you get as much of that from where you are as well as you do from the job that you're doing or the people that you're working with.
So what prompted the move from the US then? You'd graduated and then went to the US.
Yeah,
right?
So again, typical course for most Australian physiotherapists is to do your undergrad degree, do some work, do some travel, and then do a postgraduate degree. And whether that, a lot of people in the UK have come to Perth, for example, to do the Masters in Manipulative Therapy or the Masters in Sports Physio, which were very strong courses for a long, long time, which attracted people from around the world. So most people would go back and do that as we're sort of specialising in their areas, whether it's neurology or respiratory physio, and do a master's course. at the time was a postgraduate diploma. So I went back to Perth and did a year postgraduate diploma in sports physiotherapy, and then worked in a private practice for a while, which was great, but I was never going to stay there for the rest of my career, and took up an opportunity. Before you're 30 in Australia, you can come to the UK, or you could do at that stage, and have a 2-year working holiday visa, which many physiotherapists have used over the time. And again, it was similar to the US. You could work for a while, travel for a while, do locum jobs. And I did that for a couple of years after doing my postgraduate degree in sports physio.
And where were you working at that point?
Yeah, I only wanted to work in London, told the agency I only wanted to work in London because that's where all my friends were. They said, well, the only job we've got is in Portsmouth. So I went down to the Queen Mary's Hospital in Portsmouth, stayed in the nursing quarters there with, again, a whole heap of other people who were traveling around, nurses, physios, doctors, occupational therapists, and had a summer there, which was absolutely fantastic, traveling in France and the Isle of Wight. And then decided, luckily enough, and then got a job that winter working in a clinic in London where the doctor for the England cricket team was working at the time. It was a multidisciplinary clinic, really modern clinic. And another colleague, Charlotte Cowie, who I work with a lot now, who's the FA CMO, who's on our board at the Institute. She was working in that clinic at the time, 25 years ago as well, was when we first met. And there were some jobs going in county cricket, and the doctor encouraged me to apply for a couple. I can remember catching the train up about this time of year, actually catching the train up to Derbyshire County Cricket Club and sitting down with one of the captain, Dominic Cork, and the coach, Colin Wells, and they offered me a job to work as the physio and fitness coach for Derbyshire County Cricket Club, which I ended up doing for another 5 years, which again was another fantastic period of my life.
In that interview then, what questions do you get asked?
Yes, I remember a couple of them distinctly. So, and they were quite poignant. I remember Colin, who was the coach, saying, what would you do if 2 or 3 of the players turned up back in March from their off-season off and were significantly overweight? What would your approach to getting them fit be? And that's something that's stuck with me. I probably didn't answer it particularly well at the time. Coming from an AFL background, as my sport growing up as a kid was, you just didn't do that. You were expected to be fit, and fitness was a huge part of the game. Cricket, not so much. You could still get away with, and even now today, it's a skill game. And if you're not 100% as fit as you could be, you can still play at international level. The requirements are getting harder, and players are getting more professional, but that's the reality of the game. So it was a real culture shock to me to move from Aussie rules backgrounds to 30 professional cricketers who were of various physical abilities and conditions.
So what do you remember, how you did respond to that then?
During the interview, yes, I mean I probably gave probably a fairly poor answer, but trying to make as individual for the player as possible was probably my answer. I remember there's another guy who went for the job and said he was just from a cycling background, and so he was just like, well, why wouldn't they be 100% fit? I would just train them until they got fit and make them work hard. And that probably wasn't my answer, and it was more about tapping into the individual's motivation. Trying to convince them how getting fitter and being leaner potentially, or being better runner, was going to help them as a fast bowler as they went through the season and achieve what they wanted to achieve as a player, and how can you align that to their goals. And it's probably what I said in the answer, but actually the reality of that plays out as well, and it probably took me a little while to learn that, is try not to go too fast as well. I remember our first camp was a training camp out in Portugal, and the whole squad of 30 players and coaches went out there, and I was in charge of the fitness program, and we ran pretty hard for the first 3 or 4 days, and then everyone had sore groins, sore legs. They couldn't do anything afterwards, and a couple of them got injured because they weren't used to it. And that was, for me, was a really good early lesson in grading in things and catering to varied conditions. So certainly it was huge learning curve over that 5 years of working, and having that responsibility of being a physiotherapist. But also in those days, you didn't have S&C coaches at cricket clubs. The physio tended to do the fitness program as well. So that was, again, it was a really useful exercise for me, having designed off-season programs for players who were going back to Australia or New Zealand or South Africa, and running fitness programs over the winter. Really, really good, out of my depth, but very lots of learning, and probably made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, like what was it like as an Aussie going into it? Massive rivalry between England and in cricket particularly.
Yeah, and there was, and at that stage there was quite a few Australians playing for Derbyshire at the time, and I was very much an Australian cricket supporter, grown up that way, and there was a lot of banter in the change rooms, and I was very much staunchly Australian. But that certainly shifted over the last 25 years. I'd consider myself at least as British as I am Australian nowadays. I've lived here for more than I have anywhere else in the world. But that's a fantastic aspect, I think, of county cricket. You do have players, players from Pakistan, players from India, players from South Africa, players from the West Indies. It's a great melting pot of cricket culture.
Yeah. So what did you do after the 5 years in Derby?
Yeah, so I was lucky. I always had an interest in, I was always reasonably academic. I always had an interest in research. So while I was towards the end of my few years with Derbyshire, I spoke to the ECB about doing some research with them. They were interested in looking at the health of their fast bowlers. In particular, there was epidemic of stress fractures in the lower back of fast bowlers. So I ended up getting some grants from the ECB and enrolling in a PhD and starting that in about 2003-04, towards the end of my time with Derbyshire. And then a job came up as head physio for England Cricket Board. So I ended up, England Wales Cricket Board, ended up going across to Loughborough and the new academy that had started there in Loughborough, and being a lead physio for England Cricket for another 5 years. And during that time, finished my PhD, and took on that role of looking after the physiotherapy services across all the England teams. At the time, the women's team was emerging, the under-19s teams were getting more and more priority, and also they started up a England A setup as well. So there'd be an England second team, or England Lions, I think it was called in the end. So I spent a lot of time with them and their coaches over that 5 years as well.
So I guess that was around about the time when, again, I'm not a massive cricket fan, but I remember like the Freddie Flintoff, that sort of era when there was some amazing matches, like the Ashes matches.
Yeah.
So were you involved in some of those ones? There were some really epic ones around.
Yeah, I wasn't directly, because I wasn't the physio for the England team, but I started in 2005, which was the season when England won the Ashes in England. As say with the Petersons, the Flintoffs, Michael Vaughan, and so on. It was a fantastic side, a great bowling side and batting side. And I was sharing an office with Rod Marsh, who'd actually gone to school with my dad in Western Australia, who was the academy coach, and really enjoyed, on the periphery of it slightly, but seeing England really rise as a cricket nation that year. And again, that's where I guess my allegiance. People always ask me, who do I support sports-wise? And it varies. And I think it's a little bit like people who work in a club. A lot of people listening will probably work for clubs. And because you know people, you become affiliated and aligned, and you support those people. So I worked for Welsh Rugby for 5 or 6 years. So I very much support Wales in the Six Nations. I worked for England Cricket for 7 or 8 years in total, and therefore, I still support England Cricket, even though none of the players are still there anymore. But if there's other sports, I'll definitely be supporting Australia, whether it's cyclists or whether it's rugby league or whatever. So, I guess again, it's that people think that's strange, but I really think you tend to go to the people that you know and that setup that you know, and continue to support that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So in terms of that PhD then for England then, so like how had there been much research done to that level at that point within cricket?
There'd been quite a bit. Again, most of it come out of Western Australia, through the 80s and 90s, through University of Western Australia. And it was all about, mostly about stress fractures in lower backs. Was the biggest injury problem in cricket, costing the most lost time for fast bowlers. Well recognised, but it was very mechanistic, the research. It was about bowling action types and whether you had a mixed action or a side-on action or a front-on action. And if you did, the theory was that predisposed you to getting a stress fracture in your back. And I guess that's probably what started a philosophy for me around, what is causality of injuries, and it's very, very rarely a root cause like your bowling action. There's normally, and almost inevitably, many, many factors that go into someone getting an injury. And they can vary from government policy all the way down to what you had for breakfast that morning. And I think that's something that we're really embracing at the Institute now, is complexity within injury and health problem causality, and what are the big factors that you can actually change. So bowling actions, for example, if you're a 30-year-old fast bowler, there was all this talk at the time about remodeling fast bowlers' actions because they had stress fractures in their lower back. If you've played cricket and you've been a fast bowler for 30 years, it is incredibly hard to change your bowling action, any technique in any sport. If it's your tennis serve or your running action or whatever it is, it's incredibly hard to change that, especially under pressure in the competitive environment. You revert to what's easiest for your body and what works for you, that you've practiced over many, many years. So it was almost a fruitless exercise. And what would happen is either their performance would get a lot worse or they'd get injured somewhere else because they weren't used to trying to do that new bowling action. So we looked at the things which were modifiable. What are the things that contribute to stress fractures? One of the biggest ones is if you haven't got enough calories. So making sure these young fast bowlers were eating enough to manage the energy they were expending. Did they have the right footwear on? Did they have the right training program which was graded appropriately, and they weren't being overworked and their bone had time to recover, but then they were able to sustain high workloads of bowling? So it's all the things that you can modify rather than trying to change things like their action. Fast bowling is a dangerous thing to do. It's like pitching a baseball. It's not good for your shoulder, no matter how you do it. So what are the modifiable risk factors that you can manage around it? They're going to make a difference to keep them on the park.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was chatting with Phil Pask about this, that what they were doing for some of the rugby players that were coming over, and saying that vitamin D was a major problem for it. So was that a part of that sort of thing as well? Absolutely.
So vitamin D is important for bone health. Nutrition is probably the most important thing for bone health. I remember I was involved in a little study when I worked in athletics, which was after my time at cricket, was a lot of the sprinters were chronically vitamin D deficient. They had dark skin, a lot of them. They trained indoors all through the winter, and almost all of them were chronically vitamin D deficient. So you didn't have to then say, okay, we're going to give you supplements or we're going to try and address it in you. It was almost like a blanket supplementation because we knew that everyone was pretty much insufficient. So I think there, again, strategically, there are things that you can attack which are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, that not necessarily the obvious things.
No, that's really interesting, isn't it? That you just be a bit more realistic about what you're going to have an impact on.
Exactly.
And then you mentioned Welsh Rugby then. So how did that role come about?
Yeah, again, these things which are not planned. So I had a couple of years working with athletics, and that came to a fairly sudden end, and I didn't have anything to go to. First time in my life where I hadn't really got a job where I was employed full time. And a friend of mine was the fitness coach down at Welsh Rugby, and he said, "I'll come down in the autumn internationals. We're doing some screening. It'd be good to have get your thoughts on it, and you to come and have a look at it." And I had a bit of a loose end, so I went down there and spent a couple of weekends with the squad. And happened to turn out that two of the physios had just had surgery, and so they were short. And so the coach sort of said, "Well, we're short a couple of physios. Do you want to stay around for the autumn and do a contract and help us out?" I didn't know anything about rugby, didn't know the rules. West Australia is not a rugby state at all, and was thrust in sort of second weekend into a autumn international versus South Africa, which was a huge game at the stadium in Cardiff. And really enjoyed it, got on pretty well, and ended up staying there for, say, 6 or 7 years after that. It was a fantastic experience.
So what is it like then? So you've gone from, say, cricket to athletics to rugby. How do you navigate that transition?
Yeah, and I must admit that my transition from cricket, having had 10 years working full-time in cricket, to athletics. I'd worked a bit, I used to look after some Australian athletes who'd come over whilst I was working at cricket. They'd base themselves in Loughborough, so some of the Australian team athletes would come over, so I would help them out over the summer while they were competing around Europe. So I had some experience of working with elite track and field athletes, but it was a completely different world working with full-time within a governing body in a sport like athletics. Completely different culture to team sport culture that didn't necessarily revolve around physical conditioning, was more of a skill sport, to a sport where if you were 1% off in your physical conditioning, it was a difference between not only winning a medal, but even getting in a final and competing well. So very different mindset, very different culture, and one that in hindsight, I probably didn't prepare myself as well for, in terms of taking my time and getting to understand the culture before diving in, trying to do things and trying to make change. And I think that's, again, something that I've probably learned over the years is don't try and do too much too soon. Sit back, develop your relationships, see what's going on from a number of points of view before then you start to think, okay, what would you really like to influence here, and how can you make a change that's going to be positive and impactful, and take your time about doing that. And I guess I didn't do that as well as I could have in athletics, and again, it didn't work out for me or the sport at the time, and I ended up moving on fairly quickly after a couple of years. But again, learned a lot, didn't burn any bridges. Again, that's another lesson I think that's important. Make sure you leave on good terms, do a good job, and still have a very good relationship with the sport and the people in the sport nowadays, in my current role.
Yeah, oh no, well, absolutely, because it's kind of come full circle, I guess, to some extent. You're back into that area. So then, like, what does prompt you to? I know in that instance you've left UK athletics, gone to Wales. Like, are you actively looking for other opportunities, or what is your mindset when you're in a role?
Yeah, I would guess it's a little bit of serendipity and luck, a little bit of circumstance, a little bit to such a small world. And again, I think that's the great thing about sport. Sometimes it can be a barrier to people coming into sport, because it does rely so much on relationships and who you know. There's no getting away from that. But I think what I try and say to people is that, who you know is down to you. So it's up to you to develop the relationships and to reach out to people. People in sport generally want to help. They want to be contacted, they want to talk to you. So don't be shy about doing that. But back to the move to Cardiff, my wife, we had a young family at the time, just had our second child, both under 2. And did we really want to move to Cardiff? Luckily, my wife had gone to university in Cardiff. She did sports science at Cardiff Met University. I went to the university, had an interview to work on the sports medicine course at the university at the same time as combining that with the job with Welsh Rugby. So it was a bit of serendipity. It all came together. She was quite happy to go back. Knew a lot of people there, liked the city. And it was a good job combination for me. And she ended up teaching at the university as well. She's a netball coach. So, it worked for us as a family. If any one of those things hadn't have worked out, then it might never have happened. But again, they all came together, and we were happy to make the move, and it worked out fantastically.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Welsh Rugby, it's one of the more unique environments that I know. They seem to have a very tight knit group of they've been together for a long time, like Prav that we've talked about.
Yeah.
So how did you find that group of going into?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very lucky time, I suppose, when I was there. They were, it was probably the modern heyday for Welsh Rugby. They'd won a couple of Six Nations titles just before I'd arrived in sort of 2007, 8, I think. Can't remember the dates exactly. They'd had some success. I started in 2010, which was a bit of a struggle for a start, but then they won, again, titles in 2012, 13. And at good World Cups around that time as well. And so it was a really strong time that they punched above their weight considerably. We've consistently ranked in the top 4 in the world. And it was probably the best performance environment that I'd worked in. And you don't necessarily expect from a small country like Wales to be at the cutting edge of performance, but they absolutely were at the cutting edge of performance. And to their credit, and I'm not sure quite how they managed it, but had an incredibly strong culture around family. And the coach, Warren Gatland at the time, used to stand at the start of every campaign and said, rugby is important, family is first. And there's anything that's happening that you need time off, you need help with sorting out, that comes first above everything else in your private life. Look after that, we'll help you look after that. Rugby came second. And he lived that and created that culture within the sport, which is something unique. But at the same time, having an absolute laser focus on every aspect of performance, whether it was nutrition or conditioning or tactically and technically, healthcare. It was at the forefront of all of those through that period. And it's probably the reason why they were comparatively so competitive over that time, as well as having a fantastic group of players. But yeah, best performance environment that I've seen still to date in any sport.
So did that stem from Warren Gatland then? Was that where the epicenter of that was?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, Wales is a very proud and successful rugby nation in general, so I think that helps. There's a solid base for it. They're having their struggles at the moment, obviously, but they're very strong history. And Warren again had very strong coaches around him and very strong staff. And that real mindset about where can they get every single, this was, cycling was sort of pioneered marginal gains, but they were looking for those marginal gains and very much having their own identity. How did Wales want to play? What was our performance plan? And then everything aligning to that performance plan about how Wales wanted to play their rugby, which I didn't understand, not coming from rugby. I had no idea what that technical plan was and tactical plan, and still probably couldn't talk about it very well nowadays, but he had enough and everyone got a sense of that. This is how we're going to play our rugby. This is how we need to align to that. This is how we need to be fit enough to do what we need to do within the game to be able to win, and being ruthless in doing that. And I say ruthless towards performance, but also having that aspect of care for the players and the people in the organisation, which again is a very hard balance to get, but they did it uniquely well.
Yeah, it can be hard in sport, can't it? Because it's like if your results are good, then it's easier to have that philosophy. Is when they start to go wrong, then it might, it might be difficult. And having that conviction to stick with it, because it's definitely a good thing, isn't it? If you've got the right people on board to have that support, it has a massive impact for culture. Yeah,
and it does help to sustain you through the tough times as well when you've built that. But again, it does, as you say, when results don't go your way for periods of time, and I think it's probably increasingly in all sport now. It doesn't take long where a few results that don't go your way and pressure comes on, and then that's when the real challenges to culture come. And eventually cracks show even in the best cultures if you're not winning in sport. That's the nature of the beast, really.
Yeah, well, you see it with Man City at the moment, don't you? It's like they're absolutely dominating, and then all of a sudden questions start to get asked in it. Football, particularly, it happens quickly. It's so high profile, and
but no one wins forever in sport, and I think that's the great thing about it as well. Man City have had an unbelievable run, and they're still doing pretty well. They're still in the Champions League, and they're still up there in the Premier League. So they're still a great club. But that's if the same teams won in sport all the time, it wouldn't be sport. That's the nature of sport. There has to be some jeopardy. There has to be some ups and downs, which again I think you have when you're working in sport, you have to realise that you're not going to win forever. And I guess it must be hard for some people. If you're a club like Man City who've been so successful over such period, some people have not known anything but success. All they've known is winning, whether you're working in the support staff or as a player. So it must be a really challenge when you do lose a few games. How do you manage that? Because you've never experienced it before. And I guess that's where, kids coming up through the pathway nowadays, they have to be exposed to some challenges in order to develop that resilience, to know what to do when things don't go right. How do you cope with that? Because if you're shepherded through everything through your whole career and you don't know any hardship, it's very, very difficult then when you do come under pressure to be able to know what to do.
Yeah, no, definitely, and that it is important to have all aspects, and it shouldn't be a win at all costs thing, because otherwise you can't in sport. That's just not going to happen.
No, it also been in support staff. We sort of have this nature of we want to make it as easy as possible for the players. So all they have to focus on is being healthy and being on the pitch and delivering what they need to performance wise, which is right. But also, some people have even started sort of introducing artificially challenges into football academies and so on, just because they don't feel like the kids get enough challenge nowadays sometimes.
Yeah,
which is tricky.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And then so you going to what is now UK Sports Institute. How did that role come about?
Yeah, again, these things, when you don't expect it, you don't plan for it. I'd always had an interest in management. Always been in sort of leadership roles to some extent through my career, but never a full-time manager. And I saw this job, actually. I saw it advertised, and it looked a good job, but I wasn't really interested in a move at the time, and sort of didn't look into it any further. I remember sitting in my office one morning, it was a Saturday morning actually, at the university. I was catching up on some work during a rugby tournament, and a recruiter for the role rang and said, look, we've given you a name, we'd like you to apply for this job. And I said, oh, okay, tell me a bit more about it. And the more that I heard about it, the more interesting it sounded. And I ended up going for an interview in Loughborough the week after, and was offered the job, which was a full-time management job for a new area for Olympic and Paralympic sport, which was dedicated to proactive management of athlete health. Institutes had physiotherapists and doctors working for a long time, 20 odd years in Olympic and Paralympic sport. But this was a new department, a new opportunity, new challenge, appealed to me. And again, it's been a fantastic experience to go from pretty much a concept, and this is where we'd like to be in 5 years' time with this, and having the opportunity to try and shape it over that period of time has been a fantastic experience.
How have you found it moving into more of that strategic standpoint and not being as hands-on?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a practitioner up to that point. So, although I've done some teaching and done some research alongside it the whole time, I was always working as a physiotherapist, and really loved it. And so that was one of the big shifts, was having to go from not doing any clinical work at all to being a full-time executive manager. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with, because there's a lot more management jobs in sport now. So every one of the sports within Olympic and Paralympic sport tends to have a head of science and medicine. We call them heads of performance support now. Pretty much all sports have them, whose job it is to manage the science and medicine teams within the sport and align their work to the performance plan of the sport. And a lot of those people were really good practitioners. The typical story, the reason they get promoted is they're a fantastic physiologist or S&C coach or physiotherapist. And so they get promoted to these management roles. And I was a bit similar. And you don't get trained to be a manager. And management is a profession. It is as much of a job as being a physiotherapist or a dentist or an architect or a lawyer. It is a job and a role that people train for. But in sport, they don't tend to. They get put into management roles or find themselves in management roles, and you end up sometimes losing a really good practitioner and getting a rubbish manager in some cases. Generally good people, so they learn quickly and adapt. But I think it's a real shortcoming within sport, is people don't get trained to be a manager before they become a manager and be prepared to go into those roles. So for me, I made a real conscious effort to say, right, I need to learn as much as I can about being a manager and doing good management practices and being a good executive, and learning on the job alongside delivering the job, learning how to do the job and making a conscious effort to deliberately do that.
I think it's really important, like CPD, growth, development, all of that is, I love all of that anyway, but you do need to dedicate time to it. Like you say, it's an investment in that. So how do you do that? How do you upskill yourself or challenge yourself, develop yourself?
Yeah, I think it's multidisciplinary as well, multifactorial. So it's not just one thing. So, I read a lot of books on management, and I found a couple that I think really worked for me, a couple of approaches and a couple of groups who do effective management and gave really practical advice on how to do it. A lot of people give you lots about philosophy of management and leadership. Very few people give you information on how to actually do it on the ground. How do you do recruiting? How do you do people development? How do you do strategy? How do you do financial management? all of those things, they give the philosophy of, but not the nuts and bolts. And so I found a couple of really useful groups that did that, a couple of websites and podcasts that were very good at that, and would religiously listen to that. And one of them in particular, which I recommend to everyone, is called Manager Tools. And it's free podcasts, and anything you want to know about any management problem that you might have, they will have a podcast for it with some really practical information about how to tackle it. And so anytime anything come up, I would do that first, have a look at that, and then I try and apply it in my context.
Okay, tools or talks?
Tools, Manager Tools.
Tools.
Managertools.com. They also have career tools, which is also brilliant for, how do you progress your career? How do you prepare for an interview? How do you present your CV? Really practical stuff that's really effective in management and careers. So you can't recommend them highly enough. And I was introduced to that by a friend who's in a similar job to me now at the Queensland Academy of Sport back in mid-2000s, and I'd listened to their podcasts. I thought, right, I'm now a full-time manager, don't really know what to do. What am I going to do? How am I going to do it? So I pretty much religiously used their approach, which has been, really successful for me anyway. Well, not successful, you'd argue, but actually it's been really reassuring for me to have something to lean on in terms of this is how you do things, which you just don't get taught generally as practitioners coming to manage jobs.
No, definitely. Are there any? I'm always looking for book recommendations. So are there any other books that you think are good?
Well, I'll just go to the shelf. So the book which I'd recommend starting with is this one, The Effective Manager, which is that group, a guy called Mark Horstman, who was one of the founders. And this is if there is a book I suggest people read, it's this one, which again is aligned to their podcasts. But a lot of the classic great is a great one as well. One I read recently about how to get big things done, how to, big projects, big scale things. What are the common mistakes that are made? And they did a lot of research and said, well, these are the 3 or 4 common mistakes that are made. This is why big projects always go over budget and over time, and how to avoid them. So I think it's also a lifelong learning thing, which I've always been, and it sounds like you are too, Andy, really keen in satisfying that intellectual curiosity and continuing to learn all the time. I'm certainly in that bracket. And at the moment, I'm doing a coaching and mentoring course through work. I'm doing a project management and a project sponsorship course through work. So people sometimes ask, and this is some manager tools advice, is how much CPD should you do? And my direct reports will often ask that. I've got someone else, one of their reports asking to do another course. How much CPD should they be doing, and should we be supporting? And the simple answer, which I quite like, is do as much as you can until it starts impacting on your effectiveness in your job. So it should be negatively. So that CPD should be positively contributing to your role in your job. If it starts to impact negatively, you're doing too much, but that's generally quite a bit. So just keep doing it is my advice, and keep doing it through your lifetime.
There's so much stuff that you can be consuming, isn't there? Podcasts, books, YouTube, all of these things, and it can be overwhelming, and it's like you can get addicted to it. Like I've been banned from buying more books because I've got a massive stack of them, and Gabby, my fiance, is like, yeah, right, you're not buying any more books. No. And it's like, it's actually, you go into any of these Waterstones and it's like, genuine excitement. Yeah. So you're right. You have got to just know what your threshold is and what you can do.
Yeah, and I think one of the most things that I've last 2 or 3 years, I've got 2 or 3 friends who I consider friends, but also mentors, and we share recommendations because it is overwhelming and the choice is massive. And we often will say, well, I found this really helpful, and we'll share a podcast or a book recommendation, and on our WhatsApp groups or whatever. And I think that's a really good way to do it, because you could make a recommendation, and that you'll trust that recommendation. It's likely to be good because that person's recommended it, and likely to be helpful. But there is a lot of rubbish as well. And as you say, you can lose a lot of time scrolling on your phone or watching rubbish, which is fine to do as well, actually. Sometimes you need that time to switch off. But I mean, I walk the dog every morning for half an hour, and I'll tend to have a podcast on and listen to that. Audio books I've just got into recently, actually, even fiction books. And so I used to, and like you, I'd have 3 or 4 books on the bedside table, and it would take me a year to get through 3 of them. Now I found a good book. It was on Spotify, and it was also, I had the hard copy, so I'd read a chapter, and then I'd listen to a chapter and read it. And I got through it in a week, which was a new record.
It's a good idea, actually. Yeah, doubling up on it.
Modern technology can be helpful.
And then how important is it, and how easy is it for you to stay authentic in what you do?
Yeah, it's a funny word, this, isn't it? I really struggle with it. I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean to be authentic, because I do think we have different identities and different, you behave different ways, and you have different personalities in different contexts. So, you know, I'm not like, I don't behave at work exactly how I do at home with my family or when I'm out with my mates. And it wouldn't be appropriate for me to act in those ways in all of those environments, or to have one way, which is me, which I bring to all of those places. You do have to adapt to your environment, who you're working with, what you're working on, because that's just the way things work. You can't always do exactly what you would like to do and be what you would want to be in a work environment and be effective. You can be, but it's not going to be effective, because people work in teams and people work collaboratively. You know, an iPhone's not built by 1,000 individual people. It's built by 1,000 people working together to create something they couldn't create as 1,000 individuals. So for me, you do have to adapt to your environment. You shouldn't be compromising on your principles and your values, but you can't necessarily be exactly what you'd want to be or exactly what you'd want to say in every meeting, and expect to be effective. So it's a tricky one. It's one that I'm wrestling with at the moment. And authenticity, I think it is important, but I think it also is important that it's not, you know, one thing is not everything within authenticity.
Yeah, I think it's a good perspective, isn't it? I think it's, as long as your values and morals aren't compromised, they're
Exactly.
fundamental. But it's the other things, of course, you need to adapt and listen. Yeah, no, that's that's good. And so finally, like, what advice would you give to someone that's looking to either get into this area or is already in this? Like, what would your advice be?
Yeah, I think if you've got an interest in something that's outside your current role, so say you're a practitioner or a salesman or whatever it is you do in any other vocation, if you've got an interest outside where you think you might want to go career-wise in the future, is invest in it at the time. So if you want to be a researcher, do some research, learn about research while you're doing your job. If you want to be a manager, invest in getting some skills, some experience, some qualifications as a manager if you think you might want to be a manager in the future. It'll help you get the job, but more importantly, it will help you be successful and effective in the job once you get there. And it'll be a lot better for you. It'll be a lot better for your boss, because you'll do a lot better job for them. And it will be a lot better for the people who are working for you if you are an effective manager, and rather than stuffing it up a lot of the time because you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, true. I definitely needed a lot of those skills before I set up a company, but that's a different one anyway. It's learning on the job is good, but it would have been nice to have had some of the other things that you're doing along the way.
Exactly. Yeah, and you do have to learn on the job, but yeah, some help along the way is certainly recommended and makes everyone's life a lot easier.
Absolutely. Craig's been brilliant. Thank you very much for sharing. It's been really insightful. I've got a couple of books to add, which Gabby won't be happy with, but I'm excited about them anyway.
Yeah, put them at the top of your pile, definitely. And great to speak to you.
Great. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks a lot. Speak soon. Bye-bye.